All right. Can somebody just tell me, are you seeing the test review? Chinny, shake your head. Chinny, can you see it? Thank you, sir. All right, we'll get started here. And this is going to be recorded. And as I mentioned, I'll stop every 10 questions. If you have any personal questions, you can turn on your microphone or you can post questions in the chat. I'll get to those at the end of the presentation today. So here we have 50 multiple choice questions. That's been edited. It's been modified. So we're looking at 40 multiple choice questions, very similar to what you've practiced in both your Edpuzzle videos as well as the Schoology 3 quizzes that are not graded. So let's get started. Describe the difference between GIS, remote sensing, and GPS. GIS, the Geographical Information Systems. It's looking at, again, large computer databases where they can store information. They can store that data at large volumes where usually it's used to solve social, political, or any other economic problems, mostly social and health. But it can also be used for environmental, especially when we look at a lot of environmental concerns that relate to climate change. But they can store the data, you can use inquiries, you can retrieve the data, you can create mashup maps of the data. That's the overlaying of maps. That gives us a better idea of looking at spatial associations, whether they're strong spatial associations or weak spatial associations in regards to like health issues, like you were given in one of your examples. I forget if it was the reading guide or the key issues where you look at opioid overdoses. That would be using GIS, creating spatial associations where opioid overuse is found in rural parts of the United States. Remote sensing is very different. It's done at high altitudes, usually by planes or aircraft or satellites. And they, again, use the high technology to create infrared sensing where they can find finite megapixels on Earth's surfaces, usually in remote locations. And then remote sensing is commonly used by NASA. And then GPS is global positioning satellites, and that's just using a grid system, finding exact coordinates down to the overlapping of lines of longitude and latitude, also known as parallel meridians, to the degree, to the hour, to the minute, to the second of absolute locations. And oftentimes GPS and GIS will be used interchangeably or together. And again, solving social, environmental, or political or economic problems. 2, what is the main reason a geographer uses GPS to find absolute locations? 3, what type of, and again, absolute locations also know a synonym to that is mathematical location. You should have both of those for that. 3, what type of geographical tool would NASA or a NASA astronaut use while in space? I already mentioned remote sensing. 4, why are maps considered distorted? Because they're projections from a globe. A globe is the most accurate depiction of the Earth and the locations and regions on it. Why are some maps more distorted than others? Because we have various projections. All projections are distorted, but some projections are more distorted than others. When you look at projections, the most accurate projection would be the equal area map or the Robinson projection. The most distorted map is the Mercator map, and that's just through evolution of maps. 5, a map projection can distort polar regions, continent size, body of water size, but what do all maps try to portray? They try to portray countries or sizes of countries accurately. If a map has a scale of 1 to 12,000 inches, then an inch represents how many feet on the Earth's surface. Again, you need to make the conversion from units of inches to units of feet. And to do that, there are 12 feet in an inch. So you take that 12,000 divided by 12, and you have 1,000 feet is the answer. So again, if a map has a scale of 1 to 12,000 inches, divide 12 inches by that 12,000 inches, and then you'll get 1,000 feet. 7, give an example of a large scale and a small scale map. A large scale, just keep in mind, large scale is when you zoom in and you see large detail. And then small scale is when you zoom out and you see small detail. What kind of maps have the most distortion? Small scales, because they have the least amount of detail indicated in a map. 8, describe key events to the evolution of modern cartography. Again, there are many evolutionary events, and I don't want to go through all of them, but you should understand that The father of geography is Eratosthenes. The first map maker is Anaximander. There have been contribution by both the Chinese and the religion of Islam. There's been contributions by the Romans and Greeks, such as Ptolemy, that noted the Earth is spherical. Those are the main things you need to know for the evolution of modern cartography. Also know that modern cartography in the 19th century and before that was mostly for reference of locations on Earth, but now in modern cartography, it's more communication. So we've seen a huge shift in the 20th century, the late 20th century into the 21st century, of the importance of cartography being for communication. 9, describe what geographical lines you are near when your coordinates are 170 west longitude and 11 south latitude. So describe what geographical lines you are near. So if we're at 170 degrees west longitude, we are closest to the international date line, which is 180 degrees longitude. And then if we're 11 south latitude, the closest line we are near is the equator at 0 degrees longitude. Again, 0 degrees latitude would indicate the breaking point of the northern and southern hemisphere. 10, describe the main characteristics of choropleth, thematic, and cartogram maps. Keep in mind, choropleth map is just looking at a gradient scale of units, and it usually goes from a light color to dark color. So it tells us the distribution of units of whatever topic you're looking at, much as you created for like population or temperature on your last South America map. Thematic maps, they can follow any theme that can be documented through distribution maps such as like a dot matrix map. But themes can be ranging from a physical map to a thematic map of AIDS contraction. Again, it can run the gamut in terms of themes. Cartogram maps look at population, and the population is the size of a country. Any questions 1 through 10? And again, I think it's easiest if you just turn on your mic and ask the question, as long as we don't get too many people turning on their mic.
Can you describe the international dateline?
Yeah, international dateline is just an imaginary line that zigzags, that is created to divide days. So if you go, it's 180 degrees longitude, and if you go from east to west, you're going back a day. If you go from west to east, you're going ahead a day. Other questions?
Are like cartogram maps and dot matrix maps different types of thematic maps, or are they all separate categories?
Dot matrix maps, those maps, keep in mind, they all look at distribution. So they're looking at spatial distribution. Cartogram maps looks at the distribution of population, and dot matrix looks at the distribution of whatever you're looking at within a dot matrix. The larger the dot, the more distribution of that particular unit. Other questions? All right, then I'll keep moving here.
Wait, I'm sorry. Could you go over number 8 again, please?
Well, evolutionary, this just goes back to your notes. So review key issue 1. I said the most important is just really knowing Anaximander, the first map, the first one to create a map. And then Eratosthenes is going to be the father of human geography. And then you have like Ptolemy that finds the Earth is spherical. And then other Islamic and Chinese cartographers will contribute heavily to the accuracy of maps.
Can you repeat number 5? Answer number 5, or or just answer number 5.
Number 5?
Yeah.
Yeah, all maps are distorted, but what do they try to do accurately? They'll try to do accurately oceans and landforms, but they'll also try to do accurately the countries. Okay, let's keep moving. Map maker. I already talked about that. First map maker, Anaximander. First one to use geography, that's Eratosthenes. 12, compare and contrast human and physical geography. This is done on day 1, so human is looking at the Y, the basic human geographical question of the why. How is space impacted by humans? And then physical geography is looking at the where. Where is looking at the topography, the lithosphere, so the crust of the earth, the landforms. It's looking at the hydrosphere. It's looking at the atmosphere. Human then looks at the biosphere, the interaction of humans. And also human is spatial thinking. Though spatial thinking can be through spatial association, spatial distribution, spatial analysis. Again, it's the impact of humans on the landscape. 13, define, compare, and give an example of site. A site has physical characteristics that can be unique, because oftentimes they're unique because they have value to human. And so humans will use those sites to create a human activity that's valuable to humans. Situation is when you take a place and it's relative to another place. And oftentimes situations are used for directions. But situations can also help us understand the flow of economic activity, such as like a situation, Chicago would be situated in the middle of the United States because it is a perfect hub between the largest economic centers of the East Coast and West Coast. So that's a situation, a place relative to another place. Absolute location is a mathematical location, so that gives exact coordinates down to the degree and minute and, well, to the degree, hour, minute, and second. Relative location is going to be lacking mathematical coordinates, so it's going to be a broad location. It's not going to have an address. It's not going to have definitive coordinates. And a place is it's a location that has particular characteristics, and those particular characteristics have a toponym of that place. And again, that toponym is often influenced by conquerors or explorers, or it can be influenced by other large hierarchical groups, such as multinational corporations. 14, Oxford, Ohio is located 5 miles east of Indiana state line and 35 miles northwest of Cincinnati. That's a great example of a situation. Again, it shows how places are relative to one another. 15, what are the different features on a map specifically describe meridians? Meridians are just called lines of longitude. They go up and down. Every meridian is the same length. Parallels are lines of latitude. They are not the same length. They span the width of the globe. They're also known as parallels are also known as lines of latitude. Tropic of Cancer is going to be 30 degrees north longitude, and that's going to create, with the Tropic of Cancer, 30 degrees south longitude, the area known as the tropics. The international date line is 180 degrees north, or it doesn't matter east or west. It's in the middle of east and west, so it's 180 degrees longitude. Prime meridian is the main meridian for meridian Greenwich time, or mean Greenwich time. The prime meridian goes through Greenwich, England. It signifies the 0 degrees of longitude. Again, that will be the starting point of both eastern and western hemispheres. And the tropical latitudes are just the tropical climates between Cancer and Capricorn. 16, if a plane is flying across 35 degrees north latitude and 0 degrees longitude, what can we conclude? Well, if it's at 0 degrees longitude, it's on the prime meridian. So we know that it's crossing the prime meridian, which divides eastern and western hemispheres. 17, how are time zones determined? Well, time zones are determined by the degrees between each line of longitude. Every degree, or there are 15 degrees between each line of longitude. So we get to 24 time zone, 24 times 15 equals 360, and that tells us the time zones, the 24 time zones of the world. What unit of measurement defines each time zone? Again, it's the unit of measurement is going to be the degrees between the 15 degrees. What are the time zones in the U.S.? Well, we just know the main contiguous U.S. time zones. So West Coast time zone, then as you move east, you go to Mountain, then Central, then Eastern time zone. Those are the time zones that you'll have to know for the test. 18, if it is 1 p.m. on the East Coast, what time is it in Colorado? Well, Colorado's Mountain time zone, so you go back 2 hours, so it'd be 11 o'clock a.m. in Colorado. How do you measure Greenwich Mean Time? Well, that time is based on the prime meridian. And so you go, basically the prime meridian is on both sides of all 12 time zones. So it's right in the middle of all the Eastern Hemisphere time zones and the Western Hemisphere time zones. The land ordinance of 1785 divided the United States into what systems? They divided it into grid systems that were 36 square miles. Those grid systems were using lines of longitude and latitude that created a pattern, a grid pattern, that had also predictable places within that pattern. Those places centered around a government center, also places for dwellings or human residence, and then it also had areas for like churches or religious churches. Land ordinances found mostly in what is like Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, states in the east. Any questions 11 through 20?
So back, I think question 13. Are situation and relative location the same?
No, don't confuse those at all, because a location is going to tell you a point on Earth, and a relative location doesn't have mathematical coordinates. So it's a relative point on Earth that does not have specific coordinates. A situation is very different. A situation are places that are relative to one another. Other questions? Somebody's mic's on, that's distorting sound. Okay, I'll continue on with 21. Describe the difference between formal, vernacular, and functional regions. Well, a formal region has common characteristics, but they're not universal. Oftentimes, they're used in political geography. So it's the control of political forces within a country or outside the delineated boundaries of a country. Formal regions also have, again, delineated boundaries. They have clear boundaries. Vernacular is going to be perceptual or opinionated regions. Most of those agree on the cultural identity, but they're not proven facts. They're opinions. And functional regions, they're nodal regions. And the nodal regions are going to have, usually the node is going to be some economic activity, usually a service, but it can also be a communication node. And as you go out, what happens to that communication or economic activity? It experiences distance decay, meaning a decrease in that service or a decrease in that communication. Examples of a formal region can be many. The formal region of the United States, it can be the formal region of Minnesota, it can be the formal region of Woodbury. Those all have common characteristics. They're not universal. And a vernacular region, there are many vernacular regions. One I gave before, the Midwest is the next one. Midwest is a vernacular region because Midwest is Minnesota nice, and it's white ethnicity. And there's these biased stereotypes that are found in the Midwest. That is a part of ethnic identity, but it's not factually proven and agreed upon by everyone. And an example of a functional region can be like the Star Tribune newspaper. Functional region can be anything that has economic or communication activity. So the functional region of like Target would be a functional region. 22. In what ways is the Midwest considered vernacular? I just discussed that. 23. How are 9 regions the world class? Well, the U.S. Census Bureau has 9 regions, and they have delineated boundaries, and they have common characteristics. but they're not universal within the 9 regions of the U.S. That's how the U.S. Census Bureau forms a formal region. Again, delineated boundaries, clear boundaries. They have common characteristics that unite those regions. So again, a region they have distinct characteristics, but they're not universal. 24, explain the type of region that is seen through the expansion of Spanish in the Southwest. This would be, when we look at the type of region, we're talking about a vernacular region, because a vernacular region will bring in stereotypes of an ethnic group. Again, they're perceived, their opinions, stereotypes. They can be used to understand some of the biased understanding of their cultural identity, but they're not factual. 25, describe the elements that make the South a vernacular region. Again, these are opinions of the South. Opinions traditionally had stereotypes of being a low education, Baptists, churches, agrarian societies. Those would be elements that would describe the South as a vernacular region. Again, a perceptual region, not factually proven. 26, explain how televisions, government, milk farms, grocery stores, those are all functional regions because they have a node where they start. And their service diminishes the further you get away from that node. 27, explain the concepts of distribution and diffusion and give examples of spatial analysis and spatial association. All right, so this distribution is the arrangement of phenomenon or objects in space. Diffusion is the spreading of phenomenon in space. Distribution, when we look at spatial distribution, we can do a spatial analysis. One of the examples is a picture down below where you saw the human impact of, in British Columbia, on the human environment impact. We look at a particular location, and you can see the distribution of skiers and how they impact the area, and they create more recreational activity. That would be a spatial analysis. Another spatial analysis, there's so many spatial analyses, is where you zoom in on a location and you look at a phenomenon or activity, human activity, and you can see the layers of that human activity. So a spatial analysis could be like looking at genders, for instance, and we see through spatial analysis genders that are in urban areas tend to have more mobility economically. Genders that are in rural areas have less economic mobility. That would be a spatial analysis. When we look at spatial association, that's when we look at a cultural landscape and we look at features of that cultural landscape and how they are similar or not similar. So again, when we have a spatial association, we have like features in 2 different cultural landscapes. And the spatial association that was given in your text was talking about the opioid epidemic, and we see a spatial analysis between areas that are rural and a higher occurrence of opioid overdose. So there's features that show a strong association in space. Number 28, what is the difference between expansion diffusion and relocation diffusion? Expansion diffusion is rapid snowball-like diffusion, and relocation diffusion is very slow and gradual. Just think of migration. Describe the historical transition of AIDS. Historically, it was through relocation diffusion, and then recently, now it's through contagious diffusion in modern history. 29, what is a hearth? A hearth is the origin. It's a point of origin for an idea or innovation. Give an example of a toponym in Woodbury. Well, there are many examples. Jerry's Foods would be an example. Eastridge High School would be a toponym. Discuss how toponym is influenced by culture. Well, we can also look at Woodbury, and there are many toponyms that have Christian influence, like St. Ambrose School. And then names of streets are going to have historical influence, like Bielenberg, the first mayor of Woodbury. And you could pick out many other toponyms that could answer this question. Give an example of hierarchical and contagious and stimulus diffusion. Hierarchical is often from an authority. In the United States, it's mostly celebrities or politicians or multinational corporations. And you can see that through your use of social media. A lot of that's going to be hierarchical multinational corporations that spread everything on social media. Contagious diffusion is between people, but it has to be rapid, snowball-like. So contagious diffusion could be an epidemic like we're experiencing now, but it can also be human interaction on the internet, which creates rapid snowball-like diffusion, which is when videos go viral, or when they go, when again they expand to a lot of people. And stimulus diffusion is when you take principles of a previous idea. Usually it's technology and you build on it, you improve it. All right, hierarchical on a global scale would be multinational corporations will create a uniform landscape on a hierarchical scale. Contagious diffusion on a global scale. Epidemics will spread the world, but also the internet. And then stimulus diffusion on a global scale, we can see improvements in technology that are consumed within cultures. Any questions 21 through 30?
Here, can you go back up to 20? I didn't really understand 23. Like like the 9 regions. Like
Yes.
what are the 9 regions? I don't really know.
Well, you could just Google U.S. Census Bureau and divide the United States into 9 regions. The U.S. Census Bureau looks at population and demographic information, and they categorize it based on common characteristics. But those common characteristics are not universal, meaning that not everyone in those noted regions of the U.S. Census Bureau are adhere to those characteristics. But they have distinct characteristics that they use to divide the U.S. into 9 demographic regions. Other questions?
Could you give examples of expansion and relocation diffusion?
Yeah, relocation diffusion is just migration. Expansion diffusion is through 3 different models. It depends. We went over some examples here. Like AIDS historically was relocation diffusion. The movement of hierarchical, I gave many examples, like such as multinational corporations or celebrities or politicians. Stimulus diffusion, that's improving on usually a technological idea, a principal idea. And that can be like your iPhone, the generations, or it can be cars, the different models. Other questions? All right, let's continue on.
Can you please go over 27 one more time?
Distribution, arrangement, diffusion, spread, spatial analysis, analyzing a landscape, spatial association, where you find patterns of a landscape that have similarity with other landscapes. And the book you gave was opioid overdose in rural areas versus non-urban areas. Other questions? All right, let's continue. 31, what does culture mean? Well, culture means what we care about and how we take care of it. And then what are the fundamental elements? Those fundamental elements, not in any particular order, are social forms, their material traits, and their customary beliefs. 32, if you were standing on the international date line, you'd be standing on what? 180 degrees. 33, explain the concept of globalization. All right, globalization, we talked about this in class. It's the shrinking of the world, not literally, but shrinking in terms of scale, meaning that we are connected through a global economy. And how do we know this? Well, we saw it with the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and then we see it again with current global recessions with the pandemic. What are the various elements of globalization? Well, globalization, the vehicle is multinational corporations. Globalization involves the movement of material artifacts of a culture, and usually it's just exchanged between more developed regions, people with expendable income. Those that don't have income, the periphery, don't see any part of this global economy. Provide an example how globalization impacted your life. Well, many examples. Just look at everything around you that has globalization impacts on it, creating a uniform landscape. 34, how has improvement in communication helped global movement of money? Well, communication is enhanced the speed of of movement of money. So money transactions happen extremely fast, and in the future they'll happen more fast. Like I gave you the example in class of a credit card is almost too slow for money transactions. Now we're starting to see, like with Apple Pay, and we'll see continually advancements in how we pay money through advancements of communication. 35, discuss the difference between possibilism and environmental determinism. Let's go at environmental determinism. Environmental determinism says that the environment will shape social development, so humans have to adapt to the environment, and that will determine their social development. Remember that this is proved false because the areas of the world that have struggled economically will say that their ethnic determinism will say that these regions didn't have the Industrial Revolution, so they didn't advance in societies. But the ethnic environmental determinism has an ethnocentric bias that shows regions that are why they're more developed, which is false. Possibilism is the ability to modify or adapt, but it can be limited to the environment. The environment can have limitations, but possibilism gives humans the ability to modify land. Provide examples of how possible led to an increase in human modification to suit activity space. Well, possibilism has created many activity spaces, from religious spaces to extracurricular spaces to athletic spaces to educational spaces to retail spaces. It's shaped everything around us in our landscape. 37, explain how possibilism has led to sustainability efforts. Well, it's like globalization. As you continue to advance material artifacts that are valued to a culture, our cultural identity, there'll be overconsumption. So when overconsumption happens, we're talking about the limitation of finite minerals or resources, and then we're also talking about pollution. 38, define density. Density is the frequency of whatever units you're measuring occurring in a certain area. Arithmetic density is the number of people in a certain area. Physiological density is the number of people per arable land. Agricultural density is the number of farmers per arable land. In concentration, we're looking at the extent of spread, and either they're dispersed or clustered with the concentration and spreading. Patterns are looking at the geometric, they're looking at how, what geometric shape do these concentrations have? Are they geometric? Are they linear? Linear tells us a lot of times it's developed along a river. If it's irregular, it can happen without nodes. If it's centralized, usually it was planned, government planned, or it could have been planned grid systems like the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. Those would be centralized patterns. 39, how are transnational, multinational corporations a catalyst of global economy? Because their ability to spread globally through banking and through transportation systems, through offshoring businesses, and outsourcing cheap merchandise or material artifacts. Pros and cons. Well, you should know pros to globalization. One is it creates a uniform landscape, but it promotes a familiarity of service, so a level of comfortability or a heightened level of being comfortable with a service. Globalization also moves products faster, creates cheaper material artifacts. Cons are globalization increases pollution. It can erode full culture or local cultures. Globalization, a con of globalization. Well, one of the pros to globalization, it creates specialization in local economic activities. Globalization is the response of a local preference to a uniform globalization idea, like food, for instance. You might see globalization in the food that's offered, such as like McDonald's, which would create a uniform landscape. It's the most omnipresent symbol of globalization in the world. And we look at globalization maybe happening in like India, say like New Delhi, where they maybe have a substitute for meat because meat is a taboo. Or you can see globalization in the example given in like Japan, where they offer a particular menu that caters to a seafood diet. Those are ideas of globalization. Placelessness is a result to not having particular characteristics, having a uniform landscape. Neolocalism is going to be the rise of specializations, or neo means new, so the rise of specializations in local businesses. The examples that your book gives you are talking about like microbreweries, or talking about coffee shops, or the example I gave you in class is wild rice production in Native American regions. And unique cultural characteristics. All right, again, that enhances unique cultural characteristics, the idea of neolocalism. 40, compare and contrast. Well, we already talked about spatial association. You're talking about features of a landscape and finding how they are similar to other features of a landscape. Then spatial analysis is analyzing a landscape, a cultural landscape. Questions from 31 to 40.
Can you do number 33?
Well, globalization, you can watch this video again, but globalization is shrinking the world, not literally, but shrinking it in scale, meaning that the world's interconnected. And how do we know that? Through a global economy. And the movement of money and the movement of products almost happen instantaneously. For surely communication happens instantaneously in a globalized world. Provide an example of globalization. Well, again, that could be anything around you, from your material artifacts that you might have in your house or in your neighborhood. Other questions?
How can you differentiate like arithmetic, psychological, and agricultural density, I guess?
Arithmetics people, physiological is arable land, and agricultural density is farmers per arable land. Other questions?
Can you explain what placelessness is?
Well, placelessness is just a uniform landscape, a result of globalization. Places have particular characteristics that have toponyms. These now don't have a variety of toponyms. They don't have particular characteristics. They're universal landscapes that have symbolism of usually multinational corporations that create a landscape that's very similar. We see it through gas stations, retail, hospitality, restaurants. We see it in resorts. We see it in entertainment landscapes. There's no sense of place in these areas where we see globalization and material artifacts. An example that was given by a student today in class, she said she's from New Mexico. In the last 10 years, a lot of multinational corporations have come in and dissolved their unique Southwestern cultural landscape. Now it doesn't have those particular characteristics that Santa Fe used to have. That's placelessness happening in Santa Fe, New Mexico, through the spreading of globalization and the material artifacts that spread with it. All right, let's continue on. 41, describe how density changes between small and large scale maps. Know that densities can be less detailed in small scale maps. And then when you go to a large scale map, there's more detail. Just remember, when you move from those two scales, from small scale, you have limited detail, you zoom out, and when large scale, you zoom in and you have more detail. So when we're looking at really density changes, we're going to always want to look at a large scale map, not a small scale map. 42, compare and contrast relative location space and absolute location space. Again, relative location space is not absolute. It's not mathematical. It's not intersecting of coordinates. And absolute location is just that. It's absolute location, mathematical location, overlapping of lines of longitude and latitude down to the second. 43, define the elements of commonality between physical and human geography. Well, they're intermixed because humans they interact with the physical environment. And humans will interact with it differently through environmental determinism or possibilism. And again, we'll shape environments differently based on the culture and the interaction with that environment. 44, describe how human-environment interaction can create a context for understanding relationship. Well, again, human and environment can be some examples I read today with Minnesota cultural identity. In Minnesota, human environmental interaction would be during wintertime. People tend to play winter sports, or they wear warmer jackets. That's human environmental interaction between the physical environment, our atmosphere, our lithosphere, and the human activities of winter sports or wearing technology like jackets. 45, compare and contrast non-renewable resources with renewable. Non-renewable means they're finite. They have a limit. They have a carrying capacity that's limited. So they have a limited time span. And renewable is unlimited supply. Meaning they are infinite if they're not overused. All right. Some maps that you might see on the test describe the spatial pattern. Well, again, we see the spatial pattern with ethnic enclaves here in Singapore, the city of Singapore, where you can see that most of the ethnic Chinese, where's the ethnic Chinese? They're going to be found in areas that are the periphery, or not in the central business district or in the center of the city. Let's see, Chinese. Yeah. Oh, well, I take that back. Chinese are going to be more near the central city, sorry. And then other like Malays in the periphery, and then Indian in the periphery, but in the southeastern portion of Singapore. And that spatial pattern would just be looking at this distribution of ethnic groups in Singapore. Here's the example of human environmental interaction. Then we could really analyze the space and see if there is erosion to the mountain, if this activity brings more happiness to this community, more economic activity. With economic activity, does it bring more options for both men and women equally? So that we could do many spatial analyses of this particular landscape. Number 3, this again shows the scales of maps. And so here we have these, what would be a small, here we'd have a small scale map. It shows Illinois that right here, according to the map, it has 320 to 629 people per square mile. But really, when we look at the large scale map, zoom into Illinois, we can see that most of the population here is in Cook County. Same if we did Minnesota. Like I gave an example in most classes today. Minnesota, we have a little over 5 million people. But if we were to look and zoom in to Minnesota specifically, we'd see that over 4 million would be in the Twin Cities metropolitan statistical area. Mercator and Robinson I mentioned, has least amount of distortion, where they try to eradicate the distortions near the poles, as we can see right here. So Mercator is the most distorted map. It was used during maritime exploration and after the Italian, or during the Italian Renaissance, in the 1500s. So again, this one has more distortion, as you can see specifically in the projection or the polar regions. And then also, some of the size of the countries are highly distorted. And this tries to eliminate those distortions. And New York, population density in different scales. We can see, well, if it's, explain what regions of the 3 maps have the highest arithmetic density and physiological density. So in these maps, this one's going to show the boroughs, so the population. This one's going to show the physiological, the arable land. Right? There's not a key here. But this is more arable land here, where we see these areas. And so we can see the overlap of maps in these, where we see high population densities. This map is going to be right here in New York City. And so we can see that there's going to be a high overlap of population in this area. So there will be it'll be a very high physiological density. But if we were to go out here to the outer parts outside the New York City area, there would be a lower physiological density because less people per arable land. All right. And then again, know the maps and notes that you saw in both Edpuzzles and in your reading guide key issues. Any questions? I'll go to the chat here too. Let's see. Is the test anything like Rubenstein Clicker's slideshow? Well, there's always going to be similarities, but remember the closest similarity to what the test is going to look like are your practice Edpuzzle questions and also the questions on Schoology that I lay out for each of the key issues. And let me show you that real quick again if you didn't see it this morning or yesterday. When you go to Schoology and you're under unit assessments, so that subfolder, unit assessments. So we'll go here, let's take a look at the folder. And then you go to the assessments folder. And then you have these 3 quizzes that are not graded that you can complete. And again, this is going to be very similar to what test questions are going to look like. So you've had practice in your Edpuzzles, and then also if you do these unit assessments. Let's see. I don't see anything else. Can I repeat number 5? Do I need to go over number 5 again? Please let me know. Oh, turn off your mic if you want me to cover 5 again.
Yeah, could you cover number 5?
Okay, let's see, 5. 5 right here? Or 5 in the pictures?
5 in the numbered, questions.
Okay. A map projection can distort polar regions, continent size, body size, but what does it try to portray accurately? It tries to portray accurately oceans and land and also countries.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, you can use your notes on the test. Remember, it's 50 minutes, 40 questions. Other questions? All right, if you don't have questions, you can go ahead and sign out, and then I'll stay here if people want to ask personal questions.
This is going to be recorded. The meeting was recorded, right?
Yeah, I'm recording it right
Or
now,
like
so hopefully it's something that I will
Will that-
upload onto Schoology under the unit
Okay.
review folder.
Okay, perfect.